The Zalvar Empire had never known defeat. For over 3,000 years, their dominion stretched across the stars, an unbroken lineage of conquest, subjugation, and absolute control. Their fleets darkened the skies of hundreds of planets, their technology eclipsing the feeble efforts of lesser species. They ruled with cold precision, guided by the supreme intelligence, an artificial construct that dictated all strategic decisions with perfect accuracy. When humanity emerged onto the galactic stage, the Zalvar barely noticed. A primitive, warlike species from a backwater planet, still clinging to outdated concepts like patriotism and national pride. Their biology was resilient, their history violent, but their technology was laughable by imperial standards. The Supreme Intelligence calculated a simple outcome. Should conflict arise, Earth would surrender within 72 hours. The Zalvar had warred against species with planetary shielding, genetic supersoldiers, and quantum displacement cannons. Humans were an anomaly, but an insignificant one. It wasn't until General Jack O'Reilly entered the equation that things started going sideways. O'Reilly wasn't a man who played by the rules. Born in the heat of a Texas summer, raised on stories of grit and defiance, he rose through the ranks of the American military not by obedience, but by sheer audacity. His name was whispered across battlefields, a man whose strategies were as unorthodox as they were devastating. When Earth's first deep space outposts became targets for Zalvar expansion, he was sent to command their defenses. That was how they captured him. The ambush at Outpost Bravo was textbook Zalvar efficiency. A precision strike, overwhelming force, minimal resistance. The humans fought with tooth and nail, but the Zalvar's superior weaponry made resistance meaningless. When O'Reilly was pulled from the wreckage of a bombed-out bunker, bloodied but grinning, his captors were perplexed. Most prisoners begged, cursed, or stared in stunned silence. He simply chuckled and muttered, "Y'all don't know what you just did." They thought it was bravado. His trial was a formality. The High Tribunal convened in the Imperial Palace on Zalvar Prime, the heart of the Empire. Towering spires of black metal stretched toward the storm-ridden sky, the air thick with the weight of absolute authority. O'Reilly stood in chains before the assembled judges, his uniform tattered but his stance unwavering. The tribunal head, an elder Zalvar with deep blue skin and eyes like molten silver, delivered the verdict in a voice devoid of emotion. For the crime of resisting imperial authority, you are sentenced to death by public execution. This sentence shall be carried out within the next planetary cycle. The audience, composed of the Zalvar elite, watched with amusement. Executing an enemy general wasn't just a punishment, it was a statement. A declaration to all lesser species that resistance was futile. The news would spread across the galaxy. Earth would understand the price of defiance. O'Reilly, unshaken, scratched at his stubbled chin and looked up at the tribunal with a smirk. "Y'all ever read a history book? 'Cause I'm telling ya, this is the worst mistake you've ever made." They ignored his words. The execution was scheduled for the following evening. The grand square of Zalvar Prime, an expanse of polished obsidian large enough to hold 100,000 spectators, was chosen for the event. Giant holoscreens were erected to broadcast the momentous occasion across the Empire and to Earth. As the hour approached, the Zalvar gathered in anticipation. Their civilization was built on discipline, but this was entertainment. The air crackled with a silent arrogance, the assurance of victory. O'Reilly was led to the gallows, his hands bound behind his back, his boots echoing against the stone. He moved with an easy confidence, surveying the crowd as if he were the one judging them. The executioner, a towering Zalvar with cybernetic enhancements, fastened the noose around his neck. A hush fell over the gathered masses. A Zalvar official stepped forward, activating a floating drone that carried a live transmission feed. "Let this be a lesson to all who stand against the Empire," the official declared. "Resistance will be met with eradication." O'Reilly exhaled through his nose. He turned his head toward the camera, eyes locked onto the lens. His voice carried through the stillness, steady and unwavering. You boys just screwed up worse than a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs." Before anyone could process the words, he spat his cigar from between his lips, the glowing embers landing on the pristine ceremonial robes of the official. The trapdoor beneath him dropped. The galaxy held its breath. Earth watched in silence. Then the screen went black. For precisely 5 seconds, the universe remained still. And then, like a sudden clap of thunder, the quiet shattered. The President of the United States, watching from the Oval Office, finished his whiskey in a single gulp and set the glass down with deliberate care. He turned to his aides, his voice calm, yet carrying the weight of impending devastation. "Launch everything. Across the world, across every country, across every border that had ever divided humankind." A singular emotion took root and ignited like wildfire. Rage. This was no longer a battle for survival. This was personal. The declaration of war came not from a government, but from the people. Military enlistment lines stretched for miles. Civilian ships were modified for combat. Old veterans pulled their uniforms from dusty closets, their hands steady as they prepared for one last fight. Engineers, hackers, mechanics, even bartenders and school teachers, everyone prepared. America led the charge, but the world followed. And the Zalvar, in their arrogance, had no idea what was coming, because they thought Earth was a death world. But America was something worse. The Zalvar had prepared for a response, but not for the one they received. Their analysts, their supreme intelligence, their centuries of conquest, had conditioned them to expect negotiations, desperate pleas, or at best, a feeble military retaliation. What they did not expect was the full force of a species that had spent its entire existence perfecting the art of war. It began before they even realized it had begun. Across Earth, the mobilization was not one of necessity, but of sheer, unrelenting fury. The declaration of war had not been a mere formality. It was a personal vendetta, an entire planet unified under a single thought: vengeance. Recruiting stations flooded with volunteers. Mechanics, engineers, and hackers repurposed anything and everything into weapons. Factories that had once built cars now churned out spacecraft. Old veterans, some who had fought wars long before humanity had ever set foot beyond the moon, pulled on their dusty uniforms, rolling out maps of battle strategies not seen since the days when wars were fought in trenches and jungles. The first strike came from a place the Zalvar had never anticipated: American civilians. A single distress beacon, a relic of humanity's earlier ventures into space, had been activated by the remains of Outpost Bravo before its fall. That beacon transmitted on a civilian channel, one commonly used by deep space truckers, smugglers, and the kinds of people who didn't much care for interstellar law. Among them was a man named Roy Big Rig Dawson, a long-haul cargo pilot who had spent years ferrying goods across the solar system. When the distress call came through, when the last transmission from General O'Reilly's outpost detailed the execution, Roy didn't hesitate. He broadcast the message across every known frequency. Within hours, Earth's military had mobilized. Within days, civilian fleets had begun repurposing their ships into weapons of war. Within a week, Earth's first offensive had already begun. Operation Big Iron. The Zalvar controlled hundreds of strongholds across known space, each an impenetrable fortress, defended by shields and weaponry capable of reducing a planet to ash. But they had never encountered humans in open war, never faced an enemy that did not fight with tactics deemed logical or conventional. The first assault was simple: take the closest Zalvar outpost, one stationed on a barren moon, and make an example of it. The fleet that arrived over the outpost was unlike anything the Zalvar had ever encountered. Fighters crafted from repurposed mining ships, frigates made from commercial freighters, even a decommissioned nuclear submarine that had somehow been adapted for space warfare. It was a fleet cobbled together through sheer ingenuity and desperation, yet it was not disorderly. Every ship moved with calculated purpose, every maneuver a coordinated strike. The Zalvar garrison barely had time to react before the first shots tore through their defenses. The battle was over in hours. The surviving Zalvar officers were taken prisoner, interrogated not through torture, but through methods far more effective: barbecue, country music, and the overwhelming force of American hospitality. Within days, the entire outpost had been converted into Earth's first off-world military base. A single banner was planted in the moon's soil, one simple message displayed for all to see: don't mess with Earth. But the war did not stop there. Across the galaxy, human strike teams launched precision attacks, targeting communication hubs, supply chains, and fleet outposts. The Zalvar found themselves constantly outmaneuvered, outgunned not by superior technology, but by an enemy that fought like madmen. Naval commanders reported ships appearing from nowhere, tactics that made no sense. Why would an enemy deliberately ram a capital ship with a freighter filled with explosives? Why would they broadcast ancient Earth music across enemy comms? Why did their infantry seem to operate without fear? Reports flooded in of humans performing impossible feats. A squad of Marines had allegedly hijacked a Zalvar warship using nothing but knives and a roll of duct tape. A Texan militia, somehow operating independent of official military command, had commandeered an entire enemy spaceport. A man from Florida had been seen piloting a Zalvar gunship, shirtless, wearing aviator sunglasses, and drinking something called a Pabst Blue Ribbon, while single-handedly decimating an entire enemy battalion. The Supreme Intelligence could not compute the chaos. It could not process the unpredictability, the sheer irrational nature of human warfare. The Zalvar were a species of logic, of discipline and strategy. They had conquered civilizations through meticulous planning and technological superiority. But humans did not play by the rules. They fought with cunning, improvisation, and an overwhelming sense of defiance. What was worse, they fought for fun. The first Zalvar fleets dispatched to counter the human threat were annihilated in engagements that should have been impossible. The humans had not only studied Zalvar tactics, they had adapted, twisted, and turned them into something new. They did not simply engage in battle. They mocked their enemies while doing so. One intercepted transmission from an American pilot had simply been an audio clip of laughter before his fighter obliterated an enemy cruiser. Another squadron had hacked into a Zalvar battleship's intercom to blast Fortunate Son moments before their attack. The Empire was in a state of disbelief. The tipping point came when humanity launched a direct strike on a major Zalvar supply line, a hypergate station critical to the Empire's war logistics. The attack was expected. The result was not. Instead of a traditional military assault, the humans had sent in an elite infiltration unit. That unit had been composed not of soldiers, but of truckers, men and women who had spent their lives navigating the lawless edges of space, hauling cargo through asteroid belts and black holes alike. They hijacked the station not with weapons, but with technical expertise, shutting down defenses and rerouting entire supply chains. By the time the Zalvar responded, the station's entire inventory had been stolen, rerouted to Earth's growing fleet. The final insult came when a single message was left behind for the Zalvar High Command. "Thanks for the free stuff. Y'all come back now, you hear?" The Emperor of the Zalvar sat in silence as reports flooded in. His advisors, his generals, his highest-ranking strategists all wore expressions of confusion and growing dread. This was not the war they had anticipated. The Supreme Intelligence, once the ultimate authority on strategy, had suffered its first true failure. Its calculations had been rendered useless, its predictions shattered by an enemy it could not comprehend. It processed the data, recalculated, adjusted its parameters, and failed once again. The Emperor clenched his fists, his voice a low growl. What are we fighting? His war council had no answer. But across the void of space, on newly captured outposts and repurposed warships, humanity knew exactly what they had become. This was no longer a war for survival. This was a reckoning. The war had ceased to be a war in any traditional sense. It had become something else entirely. What had begun as a calculated effort to punish humanity had spiraled into a nightmare that the Zalvar could neither predict nor control. Their supreme intelligence, once infallible, had become a liability, spewing calculations that no longer held meaning. There was no pattern, no logic to follow, no method to counter the madness of Earth's retaliation. Every strategy the Zalvar devised crumbled the moment it encountered human unpredictability. Entire fleets were lost to tactics that defied reason. The Empire had fought against species that utilized psionic warfare, molecular disassemblers, and artificial gravity weaponry. But nothing in their history had prepared them for the psychological devastation of facing an enemy that enjoyed the fight. Humans didn't just resist, they relished war. They didn't wage battle with stoic discipline, nor with the cold efficiency of the Empire. They fought with a terrifying mix of ingenuity, recklessness, and sheer audacity. The first real horror came when the Zalvar learned of the Texas Ranger Battalion. The Empire had prepared for conventional planetary assaults. Shields, anti-air defenses, and automated sentries ensured no invader could set foot on their core worlds. But humans, as they had proven time and time again, did not adhere to expectations. They didn't send armored columns or precision strikes. They sent cowboys. On the occupied world of Tarvos 9, a garrison of 200,000 Zalvar soldiers prepared for what they thought would be a grueling planetary siege. Instead, they awoke to the sound of gunfire and the rhythmic pounding of hooves. The Texans had landed on horseback. The Zalvar had dismissed projectile weapons as outdated relics, unfit for modern warfare. The human response had been to bring lever-action rifles, revolvers, and pump-action shotguns, because anything more advanced, in their words, would have just been showing off. The battle was less of an engagement and more of a massacre. The defenders, reliant on energy weapons that required split-second targeting adjustments, found themselves completely outmatched by an enemy that fought like a relic of a bygone age, yet wielded it with ruthless efficiency. The final insult came when the last remaining general of the garrison surrendered and was met with nothing more than a grinning cowboy offering him a sip of whiskey. But even that paled in comparison to what happened next. The Zalvar, in their desperation, deployed their most feared weapon, an AI-controlled dreadnought, a warship the size of a small moon, equipped with planet-destroying capabilities. It had wiped out entire civilizations, reduced rebellious worlds to barren wastelands. The humans, lacking anything that could match such destructive power, did the one thing no strategist could have anticipated. They stole it, not with an overwhelming force nor with a precise infiltration team, but with a group of 5 Navy SEALs, 3 rednecks, and a hacker who had never stepped foot outside Earth before, but claimed he could make any system his bitch. They didn't just hijack the dreadnought, they renamed it, broadcasting its new designation across the Zalvar Empire. It was now called USS Southern Hospitality. The Zalvar fleet, already stretched thin trying to contain the chaos, fell into complete disarray. Half their forces tried to recapture the dreadnought. The other half fled to the edges of the Empire, seeking shelter from what they now understood was an unstoppable force. The Supreme Intelligence, its algorithms now useless, began shutting itself down. Entire Zalvar cities descended into hysteria. Propaganda once heralding the invincibility of the Empire was replaced by whispered tales of human atrocities, not of cruelty, but of the sheer, incomprehensible madness of their tactics. Stories spread of a man known only as Florida Man, who had allegedly detonated an entire fuel depot because he wanted to see if Zalvar alcohol was any good when ignited. Of soldiers who repurposed Zalvar walker mechs not for battle, but to create what they called an intergalactic rodeo. Of a Marine battalion that had sent an entire capital city into chaos just by introducing an open bar and free chicken wings. The war no longer made sense. The Zalvar had lost control. The final straw came at the Battle of Zalvar Prime. Human forces, no longer simply content with taking outposts, launched a full-scale assault on the Empire's homeworld. The Zalvar Emperor, desperate and surrounded by crumbling defenses, ordered the last remaining fleet to hold the line. The battle that followed was swift, brutal, and humiliating. The dreadnought Southern Hospitality led the charge, its weaponry now fully controlled by humans who barely understood the technology, but had figured out how to make it shoot real good. The Zalvar planetary defenses, designed to repel invasions from species that fought with order and strategy, found themselves utterly helpless against an enemy that fought with instinct, improvisation, and an apparent disregard for self-preservation. When human forces breached the imperial palace, the emperor was left with no choice. He stood in his throne room, waiting for his captors, surrounded by the last remnants of his guard. The doors burst open. A lone figure entered. General Jack O'Reilly. The Zalvar had executed him. They had broadcast his death to the entire galaxy. Yet here he stood, flesh and blood, stepping forward with the same easy confidence, a cigar hanging from his lips. The emperor swallowed hard. "You should be dead." O'Reilly smirked, pulling the cigar from his mouth and exhaling a cloud of smoke. "Yeah, well, ain't the first time someone's made that mistake." The emperor straightened, trying to maintain his dignity despite knowing what was coming. "Is this where you demand our surrender?" O'Reilly considered that for a moment. Then he grinned. "Nah, I think we're past that point." And with that, the war was over. The imperial palace of Zalvar Prime had once been a symbol of absolute power, its towering black spires casting long shadows over a city built on conquest. Now those spires lay in ruins, their jagged remains a testament to the force that had brought the empire to its knees. Smoke curled through the air, mingling with the acrid scent of scorched metal and ozone. The once mighty Zalvar war banners had been torn down, replaced by a single flag planted in the heart of the Grand Plaza, a crude but unmistakable depiction of a bald eagle holding a beer in one talon and an assault rifle in the other. The emperor of the Zalvar sat slumped on his throne, his regal robes stained with dust and the sweat of his own failure. His guards had long since abandoned him, their armor scattered like discarded relics along the marble floor. The great supreme intelligence, the AI that had guided the empire for millennia, had self-terminated in the wake of its own miscalculations. There were no more strategies to be devised, no more projections to run. The numbers had betrayed them. The empire had not merely lost the war, it had been annihilated. Jack O'Reilly stood at the center of the throne room, rolling a cigar between his fingers. He had removed his battered military coat, standing in nothing but his sweat-stained undershirt and combat pants, the very image of relaxed dominance. His eyes, however, held the weight of a man who had fought for every inch of victory. He inhaled deeply, letting the silence stretch, savoring the moment like a man who had just finished a damn good meal. The emperor swallowed hard, forcing himself to sit upright. You have won," he said, his voice hoarse, as if the words themselves physically hurt to say. Jack tilted his head, feigning surprise. "Won? Oh, buddy, we weren't playing a game." He exhaled a cloud of smoke, watching as it drifted lazily toward the shattered ceiling. "Nah, see what we did here, this was a reckoning." The emperor's mandibles twitched, his pride still clinging to some last, pathetic vestige of dignity. "Then what do you want? Reparations? Tribute?" His voice dipped lower. "Mercy." Jack grinned, but there was no humor in it. He leaned in slightly, just enough to make the emperor flinch. "I don't think you understand what's happened here. We're not here to negotiate. We're not here to discuss terms. You lost. That's it. That's the story. You don't get to set conditions." The emperor's hands curled into fists. He had been born into power, raised with the certainty that his rule was unshakable. Now, that certainty had been reduced to ash, and the weight of it pressed down on him like a collapsing star. "Then why am I still alive?" Jack shrugged. "Honestly, ain't decided what to do with you yet." He glanced toward the doorway, where a group of Marines had gathered, their armor scuffed, their weapons slung casually over their shoulders. One of them, Staff Sergeant Morales, had a clipboard in hand, reviewing notes as if checking off a grocery list. "All right, sir," Morales said, flipping a page. "So far, we've received about 100 different surrender requests from various Zalvar territories. They all say the same thing. They're done. They want to know what the hell happens next." Jack rubbed his chin. "What's the general consensus back home?" Morales smirked. "Well, the president's on his 5th bourbon, so he's probably feeling generous. The UN is still trying to process how we won, but no one's listening to and the American public." He chuckled, shaking his head. "They want a victory parade, a national holiday, and for someone to build a Buc-ee's on this planet." Jack grinned. Good priorities. He turned back to the emperor, who was watching the exchange with an expression caught between bewilderment and horror. See, this is the part where y'all usually go off begging for mercy. But the funny thing is, we ain't interested in ruling over a bunch of aliens who damn near pissed themselves at the sight of a few good OL boys with rifles and duct tape. The emperor straightened, seizing on the sliver of hope. Then you will leave our empire intact. Jack let out a bark of laughter. Oh, hell no. You ain't getting off that easy. He flicked his cigar onto the floor, grinding it under his boot. See, we thought about what to do with y'all. Some folks wanted to turn this whole empire into a parking lot. Others thought we should make you our territory. But me? I had a better idea. He gestured, and Morales stepped forward, holding up a hollow tablet. This here is a legally binding document. It states that effective immediately, the Zalvar Empire no longer exists. Instead, it's been reorganized into the Galactic Protectorate of Free Territories under the, protection of the United States. The Emperor's mandibles clicked together. Protection? You mean occupation? Semantics. Jack gestured vaguely. Basically, y'all get to keep living your little alien lives, but you answer to us now. And before you start bitching, let's be real. Y'all didn't exactly have a great thing going before. Your government was a mess, your AI ran everything, and you had more rebellions than a cheap bar has bad whiskey. So, in a way, we're kinda doing you a favor. The Emperor's breathing grew shallow. And if we refuse? Jack leaned in closer, lowering his voice to something almost gentle. If you refuse, I let Florida Man take over as governor of this planet. The Emperor's eyes widened in abject terror. He had heard the stories. The tales of a human so unpredictable, so completely untethered from logic, that even the supreme intelligence had been unable to formulate a countermeasure. A being who had once ridden a stolen enemy battleship into battle while wearing nothing but swim trunks and combat boots. A creature whose very existence had rewritten the Zalvar definition of insanity. Slowly, with shaking hands, the Emperor reached out and pressed his palm to the hollow tablet, signing away the last remnants of his empire. Jack smiled. Good man. A cheer erupted from the doorway as the Marines received confirmation of the surrender. Messages were already being transmitted across the remnants of the empire, informing every Zalvar commander, soldier, and citizen that the war was officially over. The reign of the Zalvar was done. Jack exhaled and stretched, rolling his shoulders. Welp, I'd say that about wraps things up. He turned to Morales. What's next on the agenda? Morales scanned the clipboard. Victory parties already being planned. Someone's setting up a grill outside the palace. Oh, and the boys are a skin if they can take a picture in the Emperor's throne. Jack glanced at the defeated ruler, then shrugged. Yeah, why not? Let them have their fun. As the Marines filtered out, celebrating the end of the war in true human fashion, Jack took one last look at the ruined throne room. He thought about how it all started, how a single act of arrogance had led to the downfall of an empire, all because they thought they could break a human. He chuckled to himself, then walked out into the sunlight, where the scent of barbecue was already filling the air.